Good evening and welcome to Burlington and Beyond. Thank you for joining us. My name is Adam Sinessi and I'll be your moderator for the next hour. For those of you who have seen our first few shows, we're going to break the mold a little bit this evening and we're going to invite two guests in to talk with us tonight about education. To my extreme left is Jamie Gass of the Pioneer Institute, the Executive Director for the Center of School Reform. And to my immediate left is Sandra Stotsky, Professor Emeritus of the University of Arkansas. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Our pleasure.
Pleasure to be here.
I'd like to start with Jamie. Could you explain to me a little bit about what the Pioneer Institute is?
Sure. So Pioneer is an independent think tank that's been around for about 20 years or so. We were one of the prime movers and drivers behind a lot of the successful education reforms that were enacted after 1993. But we've been probably best known for the work we've done in and around charter schools.
All right. So, as the director of your department at the Pioneer Institute, in addition to the charter schools, what have you been working on?
So what we're really known for is doing high-quality, peer-reviewed, nonpartisan research. And a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last several years has been organized around this move for national standards and testing called Common Core. Common Core is a set of national math and English standards that will be now adopted by 45 states that will be aligned with a national test. And we probably have been, in conjunction with Dr. Stotsky, two of the biggest critics of Common Core, not only for Massachusetts but for other states. And our primary concerns have been around the lower academic quality that Common Core offers in comparison to what high standard states like Massachusetts and Indiana and California and others had, the legal issues around Common Core, as well as the cost issues. Those are the three areas of research that we've focused most of our energy.
Now, why would Massachusetts, with the highest test scores in the whole country, why would we be transitioning to a different way of testing?
It's an excellent question. Just to give your viewers some context, so in 1993, Massachusetts engaged in a historic education reform effort. It was led by Governor Bill Weld. Then he later became Senate President Tom Birmingham of Chelsea, Mark Roosevelt, who is the great-grandson of Theodore Roosevelt, Republicans and Democrats coming together, working on a deal that exchanged a great deal of state resources. We've spent about $100 billion at the state and local level in exchange for high-quality academic standards, which Dr. Stotsky developed, that were aligned with MCAS testing, high-stakes testing for graduation requirement, charter schools, and then teacher testing, so that the teachers and the students were held to the same high level of academic expectations. And this reform effort has really catapulted us from about middle of the pack to #1 in the country in the last 5 administrations of what they call the NAEP test, the Nation's Report Card, in both English and mathematics. And then we have tested as an individual country in 2007 and in 2011 on a test called TIMSS testing. It's an International Math and Science test. And even just in the last couple of weeks, there's been results from a test called PISA, which is an international math test. And we're right up there with the highest performing countries in the world. So our 8th grade science students are tied for #1 in the world with the likes of Hong Kong and Singapore and Japan and South Korea. So it's been a historically successful reform effort that Massachusetts has undertaken, and that's why we think it's really a tragic move to what are significantly lower quality standards that Common Core offers.
That's really an amazing story that you just told me, because I mean, it's counterintuitive to what you hear every day, that Americans are falling behind, and here you find out that here in Massachusetts we are getting something right, and we're actually right there with the best of the best when it comes to the test scores. And
it's absolutely true. I mean, what we've done on this Nation's Report Card, winning it, being #1 5 times in a row on every grade level, every subject tested, it's really the equivalent of winning the World Series 5 times in a row and then winning it in 4 games straight each time. And then these two international measures where we've been among the best in the world is like winning Olympic gold medals. It's really a remarkable accomplishment. There's no question that the rest of the country is stuck in some degree of stagnation and decline. But Massachusetts really, I mean, there's a grant application a lot of Common Core was driven through called Race to the Top. It was really the race to be Massachusetts. That's what it was all about.
Which is pretty impressive because right here to my left, we have one of the architects for the standards. So,
And of course, the fact that Massachusetts Board of Education voted to dump the first class standards it had and replace them with Common Core's English, Language Arts, and Mathematics standards is what should be puzzling to parents as they begin to see Common Core's standards implemented in their kids' classrooms, which just began this past year. So if parents pay more attention to the kinds of lessons in math and in English and reading that their kids are getting, they will have a much better understanding of how their child's education is ultimately being dumbed down, because that is the ultimate goal of these standards, even though it was sold on false pretenses that it was going to raise standards. And of course, that was why the Board of Education claimed it was voting in favor of them. Everyone knows that there was $250 million in Race to the Top money that helped to sweeten the whole situation for a Board of Education whose chair was appointed by Governor Patrick and whose commissioner was appointed by this Board of Education and would be evaluated as well by Governor Patrick's Secretary of Education, Paul Reville. So he was caught between a rock and a hard place and had to recommend, basically, that the Board of Education adopt Common Core standards, which it did in July 2010. I was on the board at the time. That was the last meeting I attended because Governor Patrick was not interested in my questions anymore after that.
Oh my goodness. So you're saying that the race to the top is really a race of politicians to the top of the money pile that was being offered to them?
That's what it was designed to
Right.
incentivize.
I'm
When
shocked.
the USDE said it was going to have a competitive grant program called Race to the Top in January 2010 with a whole bunch of criteria that it would use to decide who would get this money, all the states immediately said, we're going to follow along with all of these criteria because we may be chosen for this money. Only 2 states got it on the first round, Delaware and I think Florida, Tennessee. And then there was a second round, which was June, right after Common Core standards were the final version was released. And all the states were busy trying to get a piece of that pie because they're all cash starved, and all they thought they were buying into was a set of standards. No one had any idea that this octopus had many tentacles, and it was only after you adopted it that you would find out about all the tentacles for getting information, databases that would have to be developed on students, what would happen to your school curriculum, your teachers training, a very strong teacher evaluation system ultimately that will lead to redistributing teachers around the state to make sure that all students are equally exposed to so-called effective teachers. Some of it is yet to come, but it's all in the works.
But one of the things that's really interesting about it are the legal dimensions. As Sandy mentioned, that this was really pushed through the National Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers. So these are the trade organizations for the commissioners of education and the governors. They don't really represent states. They represent the membership of governors and commissioners. They worked really in conjunction with the U.S. Department of Education through this Race to the Top. But the problem is there are 3 federal laws, and we've done extensive research on it, that explicitly prohibits the federal government from funding, directing, validating, advancing national standards, testing, or curricular materials. We enlisted the former general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, a guy named Kent Talbert and Bob Eitel, two highest-ranking lawyers in the federal government under the previous administration, and they've mapped it out in line and verse. The Elementary Secondary Education Law Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson, the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, and then the 1979 enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education makes it explicit and clear that the federal government cannot play a role in doing exactly what it is that they're doing with national standards and testing through Common Core.
But they claim they aren't violating the law because these two trade organizations did the work for them, and they then claim that the states voluntarily adopted these standards. And you will see the phrase state-led all over the place. The states were led by the nose, and it was race to the top money that incentivized them to adopt these standards because they did think that they were going to do something useful. We have to understand that most state board members in most states are educated and reasonably intelligent people, and they thought they were going to help students who are struggling because of the high remediation rate at our colleges. You have to understand that this was the problem that's still being presented to this day. We have a huge remediation rate for students who go to state colleges or community colleges, 4-year publics and 2-year publics. And one of the selling features was that these standards were going to make everybody college ready. That's where the magic words come from. The name of these standards were not just plain old standards, they were college readiness standards. So once a student passed a test in grade 11 based on these standards that would determine whether they were college ready, then they could go, and this was the deal that was behind the scenes but connected to the adoption. If you pass a college readiness test in grade 11, you can take your freshman courses for credit in your post-secondary institution. And that was the prize they were aiming for. So voila, you have no more remediation at the college level because your students have been declared college ready.
Okay. Well, was
That's to happen.
Was there any feedback? Because I would think, I can remember being quite proud of the state being so highly ranked with our education system and teachers and programs. Was there any resistance to just giving all of that up in favor of something
Teachers were never
new,
asked. It's a
untested?
good question, but teachers were never asked
Why is that?
because they were totally left out of the process. The process of adoption, which was determined behind the scenes by just a few people, Gates Foundation and a few others, decided that the fewer people involved, the better. So it was just to get a governor's signature, a commissioner of education signature, and a chairman of a board of education signature, and that's all you needed. Don't bother with the teachers. You have a process that looks like you've involved a cast of thousands, but very few teachers were involved, even though many states will say, oh, we had a teacher group that was advising the standards writers in Washington. But the problem was, and I was on the validation committee, so I was privy to that part of the process. The problem was that these were two trade groups. You can't FOIA them. It was a totally non-transparent process. Nobody knows what happened to the feedback. The standards writers did whatever they wanted, and whatever they ended up with as college readiness standards, which they may have decided at the very beginning, no one knows because no one has access to the feedback. No one can ask for anything. You can't FOIA anything. And these two private groups did what they wanted to do, hired whom they wanted, invited whoever they wanted, and no one can find out. They even copyrighted the standards. So right now, 45 plus states are using standards that were copyrighted by these two groups.
The thing that's really kind of remarkable too, I mean, in relation to this issue of pushback, so Bill Weld, a Republican, former Republican governor, Tom Birmingham, former Senate president, Democrat, they both had been opposed to Massachusetts adopting. They could recognize, I mean, they were very wise. They wanted to have a deep commitment to classic literature and poetry and drama, the quality of the vocabulary found in those texts and Sandy can certainly talk a lot about in even greater detail, are of higher quality, and these contribute to not only future academic success in high school and in college, but preparedness for citizenship and life. And they wanted high quality mathematics. That means having access to Algebra 1 as the gateway for all higher level mathematics by 8th grade. These were things that Sandra integrated into the previous standards, and people like Tom Birmingham and Bill Weld, they understood that, and that's why just as recently as a couple months ago when Massachusetts was celebrating the 20th anniversary of the Education Reform Act of 1993, they were both very, very clear and articulate about their disagreement with Massachusetts adopting. But Sandy's exactly right. The process was peculiar. 95% of the state legislatures in the country knew nothing about this. There were never bills or hearings or anything like that. The people that were the architects of Common Core from Washington, D.C. knew that if they had to submit a bill before the Congress for this, it would never pass.
So not even congressional approval.
There's no
No
congressional
congressional
approval
law.
and no state legislative approval for
But
it.
the
Totally.
other major group beside the teachers who were left out of the process were the parents, because nobody wanted to involve parents in what would be their children's education. This is where, during the past year, most of the protests and revolt is coming from. You may remember, as of about 2 weeks ago, Arnie Duncan got into a whole lot of hot water because he referred to these Long Island mothers who were protesting what was going on with the pilot testing. He called them white suburban mothers who think their children are brilliant, and now they're suddenly discovering they're not brilliant. He made a mistake attacking parents, but he isn't the first one who's attacked parents. They didn't care what parents thought, because the idea behind these central planners, and that's what they really are in Washington, central planners who wanted to centralize control of the whole public education system in Washington, D.C. This was Medicare, this is Obamacare, this is what Obama, not Medicare, but Obamacare, the Health Act, Affordable Health Act, was to centralize everything in Washington, and this is the equivalent, the analogy can be made to what was to happen in education, and they're still struggling to do it because parents are protesting everywhere as they're beginning to see what is happening in their children's classrooms. And it's not just public school parents who are protesting, because it turns out that Common Core is affecting private schools, Catholic schools in particular, that didn't have to adopt it. And it's Catholic school mothers in Indiana, for example, who started the revolt there because they couldn't understand what was happening in their so-called private school. So the revolt is taking place because two groups were left out, teachers and parents. Teachers are now catching up, and they are revolting against all the testing requirements.
See, the thing that's really important to remember for your viewers is that 90% of the funding for K-12 education in this country comes from the state and local level. The federal government's role traditionally has been quite small. It's been growing incrementally over the last several decades, but it's always been, a small one, a small role. And I think the founders were very wise. They understood that the more closely and more intimately connected you have education to parents, to teachers, to schools, to classroom, the people that are doing the work at the school level, the better off you are. That when you remove people from the decision making around their children or around their schools, that it tends to damage the quality and the results, because the people that are making the decisions have no stake and no direct stake and no direct knowledge in what is going on in those classrooms. And so what you're seeing is a concerted effort to ignore the evidence from Massachusetts, which is really the one state that has really gotten it right, and ignore the evidence that state legislators and governors and boards of education and people at the state, at the state and local level need to be invested and own this work because they're paying for it, that they've just brushed all these things aside. And I think you're going to see, as Sandy described, more and more problems, because the fact is, whether it's state legislators or whether it is parents, in particular moms, it's moms and grandmothers. We've been in audiences of, 5 or 6 people and of 900 people, and 70-80% of the people in the audiences are always moms and grandmothers, because they're the ones that are doing the work.
They look at what their children bring home from school.
The more they see this, and the more they realize how badly cut out of the process they've been, the more irritated and angry, frankly, they become about it.
There's another group we need to mention, and those are local school committees, local school boards. They've been almost totally emaciated by...
They've been shut out too, is what you're saying?
They were shut out. They didn't even know when the state board adopted these standards. We heard from a couple of school committee members that they were informed after the vote took place. But school boards all over the country, local school boards, had no idea what was going on until somehow their superintendents announced to them that their state board of education had adopted these standards, and now education was basically taken out of their hands. And so part of the revolt across the country are also by groups of people who would like to see more local control by the local school board. Because if parents have complaints about anything, the question is, to whom do they go? If they go to the local principal, the principal says, well, this is Common Core coming from Washington. The local school board can't do anything because the decisions are being made about the tests by large testing consortia, and there's no process for even revising these standards. They were carved in stone.
Forced upon us.
They were forced. They weren't so much forced, they were voluntarily adopted by our school boards after being incentivized by the thought of a sugar plum fairy holding lots of money.
We're talking state school boards?
State boards of education, most of which are, not most of which, many of which are appointed by governors. So if governors signed on, they made sure that their state boards of education were going to do as they wanted. That was what happened in Massachusetts. It's an appointed board by the governor for the most part.
So do we have some initial results, since it's at the initial phases of being implemented?
No, not yet. It's a good question. That's the problem. It's too soon. The tests haven't even been developed yet. They're being piloted here in Massachusetts this year. The State Board of Education just agreed to allow piloting to take place over a 2-year period. So no one knows what the results are going to be, but it will be too late to get out of Common Core, because once you have adopted Common Core standards under a previous law, No Child Left Behind, which is what Congress did vote in under the Bush administration, there has to be a state test of state standards, and the scores have to be reported to Washington. So even if states got rid of Common Core, they still have to have a state test of some set of state standards and report scores to Washington. States are in a bind. They can't figure out how to get out of the conundrum that their own state board of ed voted them into.
The thing that we do know early on, so Massachusetts adopted Common Core in 2010, July of 2010, when most people were at the beach or relaxing or barbecuing and have a good time. They had a Board of Education meeting, and that's when they dumped the higher quality standards in exchange for Common Core. So, but it's been several years now. They've been beginning to align these state standards, which are the set of expectations articulated by the state that they can get matched at the local level. And what we do know is that the national, as well as Massachusetts has done on this NAEP, this Nation's Report Card, the strongest predictor of future academic achievement is 4th grade reading. And both on the MCAS and the NAEP scores from Massachusetts were beginning to drop. And so that is it's a predictor, I think, or a canary in the coal mine of what is likely to come. But it's going to take years to fully implement it, and we won't know the real results on what Common Core is going to mean until they convert. The MCAS has gotten away, they do away with it in the next year or so and then replaced by this national test. But the early indications are not promising. And what we also know is, again, from the data and the research, is that this commitment to higher quality classic literature, things like Huckleberry Finn and Sherlock Holmes and Dickens and all of this, that this has led to historic gains here in Massachusetts. Common Core cuts that dramatically by about 60%. So common sense will tell you if you start turning away from the kinds of academic commitments that you've made for more than a decade, that it's likely to have bad results.
Except that we won't know it from other indices, because one of the very clever moves that the central planners are making is to make sure that all the external measures that are available, SATs, ACTs, and any other AP tests, are all being aligned. The GEDs, that's the General Education Diploma for those who leave high school or want to get a high school diploma. All of those external measures are being aligned down to Common Core. So no one's going to be able to find out how dumbed down we've become, because all the measures will be in sync together. There won't even be international tests necessarily, because the latest one that Jamie mentioned, PISA, Program for International Student Assessment, is only a test of skills for 15-year-olds, and it uses for its math content mathematics that mathematicians tell me is about at the 4th grade level. So if students are being measured for their skills on a test that is using math content at a 4th grade level, then we won't even know how far down our high schools have sunk. It's not designed to strengthen high schools. It's to get access to college for low-achieving students so that they can get out with a college diploma. That's why President Obama keeps saying we need more people with college diplomas. Not we need more knowledgeable people. We need more people with college diplomas, because that's the only way they can figure out how to close the gaps.
One of the things I think is both interesting and very troubling about Common Core too is that most of the organizations driving Common Core, the Governors Association, the Council of Chief State School Officers, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Achieve Inc., the Fordham Institute, these are sort of what they call Beltway bandits. They're trade organizations and organizations that have been sort of coalescing around Washington, D.C. for decades. The problem is that none of them have actually improved student achievement anywhere in the last 20 or 25 years. These are not organizations with very good or proven records, either on standards or improving student achievement. What's even worse about it is that the key architects of the standards themselves, David Coleman, who is now the head of the College Board, which creates the SAT and the AP, Sue Pimentel, Jason Zima, who worked on the math side. None of the three of them actually have much experience at all working on standards before.
They had no teaching experience also.
They had no teaching experience at all. So not only do you have organizations that have received, in some instances, the upper levels of $170 million from the Gates Foundation to advocate and develop the standards, etc. The people that develop them have poor records, and they're not. And this is now being foisted on, approximately 45 million school children across the country. What they didn't do was replicate the successes of Massachusetts and the lessons from Massachusetts, which were hard-won and unique. I mean, it really.
We don't think they cared. Because one of the central issues, and I want to get this out for this segment of the program, in mathematics, I've worked with a mathematician named Jim Milgram, who is a retired mathematician from Stanford. He has looked carefully, because he was on the validation committee with me, and has pointed out that there is no way you can prepare students for a STEM career, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, because the standards aren't there in Common Core. But the only people who would know that would be high school math teachers and people in science, math, or engineering at the college level, because who else can read a set of high school math standards? I can't. And unless you are in one of those areas, I bet you couldn't either. You'd have to be in one of those areas. So what you have is a set of math standards being imposed on our public schools that end at about Algebra 2. That's the end of high school math, which means that we do not prepare any students for STEM careers, which is what most Americans thought we were getting out of national standards. So you end up with a dumbed-down high school curriculum out of the process.
So how do they come away with the term college ready? Sounds like
They've-
shovel-ready, but
That is part of the fork-tongue approach. You say one thing, but you really mean another.
this is really happening in this case.
And this has been a series of maybe not deliberate lies, because the goals were social engineering and social justice. And so if you say you're going to produce college-ready students, but you've redefined what it means to be college-ready, you are still producing college-ready students, but they are for colleges of the future, where the college is essentially doing high school level work.
My goodness.
So that's what your new goal is, but parents don't know that. And here in Massachusetts, this is going to be sad, because this is a very high-tech oriented state. And most parents whose kids are going through high schools like Burlington or Brookline or other high schools where you have large numbers of parents who probably work in a high-tech area in some capacity, their kids may or may not have a trig course, may or may not have a pre-calculus course in order to get into a STEM major, if they get into a college that admits them into a STEM major, because the standards aren't there in Common Core, and we don't know what superintendents are going to do. Someone should ask your own superintendent, will he make sure that your high school math department goes beyond Algebra 2 and puts in the pathway to STEM? We don't know. Each superintendent may have to make a different decision, because there's apparently no leadership coming from the Department of Education on this. We're trying to find out, and we still haven't been able to find out, is anyone from the Massachusetts Department of Education telling superintendents in this state, including the superintendent in Burlington, that the standards for getting kids to a STEM career aren't in Common Core. And if you want to get any of your students who are good in math and science into a selective college that will maybe give them the opportunity to major in math, science, economics, engineering, whatever the new majors are that require calculus as the beginning or as the freshman math course, will those courses be available in your high school to make sure those kids can do that? We don't know yet. It's just beginning, so it's hard to know, but we have no sense that there's any leadership in any state, not just this state. The only thing I've heard, and I was talking about it with Jamie today, Wisconsin is having a struggle about how to get rid of Common Core. And one of their state reps, in conjunction with others, is developing a possible bill in which they are going to impose a STEM track on their high school curriculum. Now, what does that mean? They've already adopted Common Core, but they're seeing that as the floor, and they don't want it to be the ceiling. So here is the state legislature thinking about saying you're going to have a STEM track available, not required for graduation. We don't expect every kid to take trig to graduate from high school, otherwise we would have very few high school graduates. But at least it should be there, so we can produce doctors, engineers, and scientists in the future.
One of the things that Dr. Stotsky mentioned, which I think is really important, is the real intellectual dishonesty that has sort of surrounded this effort. And maybe the best example of that is when the Board of Education adopted Common Core, they relied on evaluations of Common Core that were conducted by the Massachusetts Business Alliance for Education, the Fordham Institute, and Achieving. All three of those organizations had accepted money from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the same organization that paid for the development of the standards themselves. And the Commissioner of Education was absolutely fine with this. In fact, there's even further evidence, and several years ago, Channel 5 did an expose on the travel of the Commissioner of Education. He was being flown around the country by the Gates Foundation and Achieving and others to have other states adopt Common Core even before Massachusetts had. So there's a lot of conflict, financial conflicts of interest. There are a lot of issues here about basic transparency and public accountability. but just the integrity of the process was really stunning. And the fact is that we have for 2+ years now, have had a very wide-ranging Freedom of Information Act search submitted to the State Department of Education, which they have not complied with. They're violating state law in that regard. And we've worked with other people to submit a Freedom of Information Act search about Common Core and the decision-making and the policy-making on it for the U.S. Department of Education. And that, too, is being brushed aside. So what's, I think, most remarkable is that, I mean, these are the people that are supposed to be educating our children about democratic processes, about the importance of upholding the public trust, about administering justice and teaching justice. And they themselves are brushing aside federal laws that prohibit the federal government from doing these kinds of things. They're brushing aside laws related to transparency and accountability. And they're engaging in these naked conflicts of interest with organizations who are also the advocates of it. It's very, very troubling on lots and lots of different levels. But you know, there has been this is at a minimum intellectually dishonest, and in some instances violating the law itself.
Are you willing to speculate what the motivation of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation would be to force this on the country?
Well, you know, I don't know what their motivations are. I'd like to assume that they want to improve the quality of academic achievement across the country. There have been a lot of people in and around Washington, D.C. for decades that said that national standards and testing and curriculum that's the silver bullet. If we are able to accomplish this, that it'll boost performance nationwide. I just don't buy that. I think, again, we know from the experience in Massachusetts that when legislators and lawmakers, people that pay for it, parents, school committees, they get invested in this work and are part of this work.
But we really don't know why Gates has done it.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
the basic question
And
that we
I
really
think
need
that
to focus on.
and I think
no one knows.
They really believe that this is the way to go. The fact is that there are some countries in the world that have national standards that are higher performing than the United States. There are some countries that have national standards that are lower performing. Our most immediate neighbor to the north, Canada, has a totally decentralized system of education. It's determined province by province. They don't even have a national Department of Education, and they're outperforming us. They're the ones, in terms of our traditions and our laws, are probably most similar. And the fact is that there's no direct correlation between having national standards and tests and having higher student achievement.
You know, it's not really clear why the Gates Foundation has funded a complete turnaround upside down of the entire public school system, because it isn't benefiting the students at the bottom, which one would expect to be the major goal of what originally had been described as social justice standards. The idea was, how do you help those at the bottom? This has been driving federal policy since 1965, Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty. That's when the first authorization of ESEA took place. And with every reauthorization, there have been more and more federal ties that have gone out, links, chains, tentacles, whatever you want to call them. Remember that No Child Left Behind was a reauthorization of ESEA. It's been held up recently because it's supposed to be reauthorized again. But the Duncan administration, under Obama, wants to put in Common Core in its new reauthorization language, and this is what Congress is not willing to allow. But in the meantime, the USED goes along doing whatever it wants to do, because it still gives a certain amount of money through Title I, which is the old No Child Left Behind money. And states want to get that money because even 10% more is better than not having the 10% more. And once people are spoiled with extra money.
And of course, that's only if they just care about the money, not the education, not the quality of education for the students.
That's right.
It seems like one of the hopes is for the next generation to be smarter than this generation was. And it sounds like there's not much hope for that. And I'm hearing a few grumblings from some parents that don't believe they're getting as good an education as they're expecting their kids should have.
They will be
probably
told
right.
that it's more rigorous. You see, this is part of the problem. People want to believe. In this country, most people have trusted educators, trusted their school system. A school system has to be based on trust between parents and teachers. Otherwise,
Can happen without that.
it can't happen at all. If parents distrust, as they did in other countries, what their educators were telling them because they knew that they were being told blatant lies because it was controlled by a Ministry of Education that had a vested interest, then you had subversive ways that parents would figure out how to insulate their own kids from what they knew were lies being taught to their children. Right now, parents still in this country trust at the local level who they have, and they're not willing easily to understand that maybe there are central planning kinds of functions that are designed basically to lull them into thinking that they're getting something better rather than worse.
Would you say with trust too, there's maybe a lot of apathy and complacency with parents, that they just assume that, oh, kids are all right, and
You're right, and there's that other element that parents are too busy now. They're economically stressed, so they're not all paying as much attention. Very few are in the public schools. That's why when you look at homeschoolers, we're seeing large groups of homeschooling parents because obviously they've made a commitment to pay attention to their kids' education, and they're the ones who are very scared about what this means for them. Parents who send their kids to Catholic schools are concerned because they have a special investment. They've chosen a private school and they're paying tuition in addition to whatever taxes they pay. So they are concerned. But ordinary public school parents, it's only when their kids come home crying, as they happen to do in New York State, in Long Island, and in upstate New York, about the testing conditions, and they begin to see bizarre things that their kids are being taught in math class, or they're being asked to read peculiar things that they wonder how come in school they're reading some of this garbage instead of
So if
other stuff.
if I could ask you this question then, would you have any advice for the parents in Burlington who are not satisfied with what they may be getting through Common Core as it gets more and more implemented?
I mean, the first
What
thing
could they do about
the
this?
first thing I would recommend is to reach out to the State Board of Education and to the Commissioner of Education, the Governor's Office, and their elected officials in the
Their state reps.
state reps and state
Are
senators.
the first ones they should
That's what
contact.
they should do first and foremost. But there have been a variety of different school committees across the country, across Massachusetts. The Tantasco Regional School Committee out in central Massachusetts, the Mashpee on Cape Cod, that have actually passed resolutions against Common Core. They're concerned that the dumbing down of the standards is going to have an adverse impact on their kids. And
But what can the parents do? This is
and they
beside
can,
complain
they-
to
they-
legislators.
then they can start to do what parents have done across the country, which is start to organize, get themselves educated about what Common Core is about, and all this material is available on our websites and Sandy's website.
Could you give out those websites
yeah,
just so
it's,
people have a resource?
www.pioneerinstitute.org and Sandra's.
And my homepage at the University of Arkansas has my testimony, and that is simply Google Sandra Stotsky, Arkansas, and it'll pop up. It's one of the top items. So complaining to a state legislator because they have more power at the state level, Congress seems to be out to lunch altogether. I wouldn't try to do anything much at the congressional level, the federal level. USDE seems to be doing whatever it wants to do. So state legislators have to pay the bills because the technology that's used for the testing has to be paid for at a state level basis. The taxes that have to be raised to pay for extra Common Core expenses are going to be local state taxes. No more money is going to come from Congress for this kind of stuff. So what else can parents do? If they can homeschool, they might consider. There are large growing numbers of homeschoolers everywhere. It's a growing movement, stimulated in large part
so that's
these
one-
days
one
by
option.
Common Core.
But most
Interestingly,
people couldn't afford that then. You recommend going
If-
to the state legislatures because they have the power of the purse.
they should know.
And-
They
and-
should know.
And and the reality of it too is that there are a lot of we've done the only independent analysis of what this is going to cost, because even though the Gates Foundation has spent $170 million advocating for it, even though there's been 45 states have adopted, the fact is that no state legislature that I can think of off the top of my head, and it never happened in Massachusetts, actually did a cost analysis. And Pioneer conducted an independent cost analysis. It's going to cost the country about $16 billion to implement Common Core. In Massachusetts, where we already spend $9 billion at the state and local level to implement these higher quality standards that we had, it's going to cost an additional $360 million to implement.
And it'll come from
Common Core.
local and
It's going to
state.
come at the state and local level. And that's what you're already beginning to see, is that local school committees and superintendents are beginning to grumble, even on the cost of the pilot test for this park, which will replace MCAS.
But my concern is more about the content of the education, because that's where I have focused most of my analyses. And parents need to pay more attention to the lessons there, to whether or not they have the time. They've got to make the time. Somebody has to pay attention to the lessons. Are the kids being given homework assignments? What kind of homework? Complain to your local school committee. I mean, we still have locally elected school committees. They will see how little power they have, but nevertheless they have to hear, so they can talk to their superintendent, talk to the superintendent of schools. They have to hear. Somebody has to be complaining, because it's the squeaky wheel eventually that gets the oil, as we know. And if enough parents keep on complaining, it eventually percolates through.
So concerned parents need to continue making noise and talking to everybody.
They can't be
Including
silent
shows like
because
this, including the
teachers
websites.
are afraid to speak up in many places. There's been an intimidation of teachers in many states and in many communities, even here, where they're afraid they will lose their jobs or get a poor evaluation. I know a teacher in Arkansas who was given needs improvement because she had been talking to the press about the Common Core assignments, and she was told to shut up, basically.
Can you give our viewers some tangible examples of how the curriculum is laid out and how it's been weakened?
In English, Jamie talked about that.
I'll give one sort of dramatic example, and Sandy can go into even more detail. So my boss, Jim Sturgis at Pioneer Institute, was on a national television show recently, because the way in which Common Core teaches the Gettysburg Address is one that is supposed to have just focused on the text, but children are supposed to ignore all of the historical context. So you're not supposed to talk about the Civil War. You're not supposed to talk about the fact that it's consecrating a cemetery. You're not supposed to talk about Lincoln or his history or his presidency.
Cold reading,
They
it's
call it
called.
cold reading. And I think most people view this as bizarre, frankly, approach to literacy. Not to mention the fact that, as much as I love the Gettysburg Address, it probably belongs in a history standard, not in English class. English teachers are supposed to be teaching English text, right? They're supposed to be teaching literature and poetry and drama. That's what their training and expertise. That's why, frankly, most of them went into it. And that really the Gettysburg Address, as great as it is, really probably belongs primarily in a history class where you're going to understand and be taught the context of it. But Sandy can give you a lot more concrete examples of what to look for.
You have this issue of reducing literary study and bringing in more what is called informational text. This is a well-known controversy that newspapers around the country have been writing about. One example that I just saw recommended by the National Council of Teachers of English a couple of weeks ago struck me. They were saying, if the English teacher teaches The Great Gatsby, for context, have them assign reading material on the Teapot Dome scandal. Now, think about that as the context for reading it's not going to help you understand The Great Gatsby at all. And indeed, the English teacher is probably not going to be able to explain the Teapot Dome scandal very well either, unless she brushes up on it. I mean, I studied it in a history textbook when I was in high school, but I couldn't tell you many details today about the Teapot Dome scandal, nor would I think of that as the context for a literary work. But the idea is that it's informational. So you get bizarre assignments like that. There are other examples, but that was the most recent one I came across. Parents have to look to see what it is their teachers are assigning, because in many cases their English teachers know they've got a 50% quota to fill, and so if someone says this is available, it's in the closet, or we've got extra copies of it, what is it? Is it worth reading? Does it make any sense? And that's what parents can be alert to and complain about to find if they don't think it makes sense.
Is that part of the uniqueness of the standards here in Massachusetts is that they were aligned with our own literary history. So Hawthorne and Melville and Emerson and Thoreau and Emily Dickinson and Edith Wharton, all the luminaries, the best noted figures in American literary history, many of them were from Massachusetts. So it makes sense that kids from Massachusetts would learn these things. I mean, you know,
And are you saying under Common Core they wouldn't necessarily learn
We don't
about
know
the local
yet.
legends?
Because
They'd
they've
have
got
to
a
study somebody
50-50
from
divide.
Texas, California.
It's less likely, and the reason why it's less likely is that they cut this classic literature by about 60% in Massachusetts. It will not likely be on the test, and the test will be the basis, the student performance test will be the basis for teacher evaluations. So a teacher who lives in Pittsfield and wants to teach Moby Dick, written by Herman Melville, which was written right outside of Pittsfield, would be at a disadvantage because it's not going to be it's not in the standards, it's not going to be on the test, and she's going to be evaluated what's on the test. So there's no incentive for her whatsoever to teach that. Now, you know, Moby Dick's a difficult text, but there's a lot of other examples like that where you know, this commitment to classic literature and poetry and drama is just a qualitatively better way to go about educating kids. And the Common Core folks, they just philosophically don't believe that that's the way to go.
They want students reading more informational stuff, which can include manuals, government reports, editorials, speeches. There'll be a lot of contemporary political speeches.
And there's no requirement to learn cursive anymore, I've heard.
No, actually, Massachusetts did
Oh, they
vote
did,
back
okay.
the teaching of cursive. So, but it's only one of a few states that have.
But you're correct about that. It is not explicitly clear within Common Core that cursive
not in
will be
Common Core.
And in fact, if anything, because Common Core is really more of a kind of workforce development approach and training approach, they prefer keyboarding to cursive. So a lot of states have begun to pass bills saying, no, we want to make sure cursive is taught in the schools.
The states could adopt 15% more than whatever was in Common Core. And this state's Department of Education put in another 15% math standards to strengthen what was in Common Core. In English language arts, it actually brought back some of the features that were good in the older standards, the two appendices that had lists of authors. So there were people in the Department of Ed who were trying to bring back some of the better features so we wouldn't lose everything altogether. They recognized that we were dumbing ourselves down. I mean, it's pretty obvious when you take a look at the two different sets of standards. And teachers in the schools are going to know, but parents won't know because they have no basis for comparing. If they have a child going into grade 11 who hasn't been in grade 11 before, or they haven't had siblings in grade 11, they will not know what was taught 5 years ago. They have nothing to compare. So for those parents, it's going to be hard unless they begin to think about what they themselves may have studied when they were in high school years ago, if they can remember, or ask people in math.
And the thing, though, too, it's important to, no matter what Massachusetts adds on to Common Core, 15%, the whole goal of Common Core is national uniformity. So the only thing that's going to be on the test is what states share in common. And that's why, for all intents and purposes, Massachusetts right now, because of Common Core, has the same academic expectations as they do in Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and all the lowest performing states in the country. So whatever the State Department of Education talks about adding on or augmenting. It's not going to be on the test. And
That's
teachers
right.
will teach to what is on the test because it's in their best interest, and they're going to be evaluated on those tests. They're going to teach to the test. So they're not going to add on these things that really,
No.
we know are big
We
contributors to
also
improvement
don't
in
know
education.
where the cut score is going to be on these tests, so we can't tell you yet. Nobody can.
It's the pass-fail
What the
rate.
level
or,
of
level.
difficulty is, because that's going to be the last thing they do, and we're not even sure who's doing it because there's no transparency in this. We're in the dark, and our whole public school system is basically going down the drain or under the control of forces that are outside of the state, and parents are left in a very helpless position, as are local school committees, and maybe even superintendents too, because they can't change what is being determined from on high, Washington, D.C., or from a consortium of 26 other states. It's a whole different ballgame, and no one quite understands what's going on. This is why it's been easy.
Sounds like it must have been put
Corrupted.
together by people who were very jealous of the Massachusetts education miracle, and were jealous of it and wanted to bring them down rather than having to raise their own.
I think there's no question. You're absolutely right. There was
be an element of
they
that.
were Massachusetts was seen as a real outlier. We heard that over and over again. Massachusetts is different, and we're an outlier. And can't Massachusetts make these compromises so that they can lift up Mississippi and Alabama? And again, I just think the evidence is overwhelmingly clear. There's a lot of factors why Massachusetts was number one. It was great standards that were developed by people
But
like
they
Dr.
didn't
Stotsky.
want
but
our great standards.
yeah,
That's the point.
That's right.
They didn't want they didn't start with them. That should be the first clue to a lot of people.
Right.
That if this movement had started with good intentions and wanted to strengthen and improve public education in this country, and it needs strengthening, it needs improvement, why didn't they start with one of the best sets of standards? California's, Indiana's, Massachusetts, they had several states to choose from, but no, they ignored the best standards
Why do you think?
because they had other goals.
Right.
And that's what we say,
and-
we don't know. We
but
really
I
don't know
think
what those
they
other
they
goals
knew that
were.
the only way they could get 46 states to adopt was to have standards that were really a race to the middle. There was no way they were going to get Alabama or Mississippi to adopt Massachusetts quality standards.
Well, they didn't try.
Yeah.
They didn't
I
try.
think they clearly want to nationalize education. I mean, it's the
They
federal
wanted
government
to
takeover,
centralize control,
right?
and once you get your foot in the door and centralize control, then
can do
you
whatever
go
you
where you want. But they didn't want to start with good standards, which they could have done.
Right. That's not the intention, right?
It didn't seem to be the intention.
One last thought here. We have to wrap up pretty soon. But is there a possibility, I think it's pretty clear that Common Core is bad for Massachusetts. It's obviously a step backwards. Is it worthwhile to consider that it may be of some benefit to the lower performing states, or is it just...
We don't even know that yet. That's been the major claim by its proponents. It will be better for states like Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and so forth. But we don't know that yet, because the major problem that I see, based upon my own professional experience, is that you need to have a strong teacher. And without strong teachers, it really won't matter. And in those states, you have many weak teachers because the whole literate culture of the state is too weak to support the kind of stronger teacher that we have in Massachusetts. I was able to develop licensure tests and raise the standards in teacher preparation programs. If you want to raise standards, you have to have teachers who can teach to them. And in states that are weaker, you have to have, in rural states, and I learned this when I was in Arkansas, what teacher wants to go back to teach in a rural area where the nearest town is 30 miles away?
I'm being told we need to wrap it up.
Okay.
But I have the feeling that we could have really talked about this for a couple more hours, so we're going to have you back at some point. Thank you for joining
very
us. I'd like
much.
to thank both of our guests this evening, Jamie Gass and Sandra Stotsky. Please,
My pleasure.
Our pleasure.
Please check them out online. Thank you to the viewers for joining us, and thank you to my other two panelists, Larry Way and Paul Giroud. Thank you
you.
very much.
Thanks so much. Appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us.